Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome indeed to the book launch for Dr. Zeynep Kilicoglu's Deconstructing Refugee Women's Empowerment. Yes! My name's Clare Hemmings, and I'm Professor of Feminist Theory at the Department of Gender Studies at LSE, who are also your hosts for this evening. It's lovely to see so many people, family, friends, colleagues, here tonight to help Zeynep celebrate her achievement with us. Here's how things will go for this evening. I'll briefly introduce the book and our author, and then our speakers. And I'll, after the panel for the speakers, I'll open up to discussion from the audience. So please also join us for a drinks reception at the Department of Gender Studies afterwards, which is the 11th floor of Pankhurst House. So just follow the group as we move to the drinks. Before I do anything else, I have a very important part of the evening to proceed with, and that is the raffle, which is raffling one of Zeynep's books. So you really, how many of you put in for the raffle? 81 people. Whoa, that's amazing. Okay, what's the money going to? What's the money going to? Oh, the publisher. Okay, the money's going to the publisher. Good cause. That's true. You know, publishers need money. And so, without any further ado, I'm going to announce. So you have to be here to collect your prize. This is the thing. So if the first person from the winner of the raffle list isn't here, I'll go to the second. Okay. So that's how it's going to work. So the winner is David Johnson. Come on down, David. Fantastic. Okay. So, Zeynep is a feminist scholar specializing in migration and forced displacement. Her research explores how humanitarian asylum organizations in Western Europe, particularly in the UK and France, construct the identities of refugee women. She works closely with feminist and queer activist networks and engages directly with refugee and asylum-seeking women from diverse backgrounds. Her epistemological approach is rooted in ethnographic methods, emphasizing the co-creation of academic knowledge in partnership with marginalized communities. Her research is supported by various institutions, including the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. So Zeynep, my colleague and friend, you joined the Department of Gender Studies in January 2024, and it feels actually like you've always been here. I've been privileged to be your mentor during this time, and I've been consistently impressed by your energy, dedication, sheer hard work, and your commitment to celebrating others. So please let us celebrate you. I've already learned so much from you, and so I was really happy that you invited me to be the chair for this event, as it's given me the opportunity to read your rich and important book. Thank you so much. Working from a deconstructionist, intersectional, feminist and post-colonial approach, Deconstructing Refugee Women's Empowerment intervenes in the emerging literature by challenging a dominant vulnerability versus empowerment approach. Without letting go of that question of vulnerability for women, you explore how for some refugees, their new worlds can be sites of increasing empowerment as well as profound difficulty. As women move They might, for example, encounter new opportunities outside of their kinship contexts or develop new organising skills encountering the racism and misogyny they face in both the UK and France. I love that argument. You make it deftly and with nuance, never letting go of the power relationships that shape the conditions of these contexts for women. The empirical work in this text is rigorous and also profoundly moving, building on semi-structured interviews with refugee women and aid professionals and participant observation in refugee communities. You take the narratives of those whose lives you are prioritising deeply seriously and are attentive to the competing demands and contradictions that make up the everyday lives of the women you centre. It was lovely to read of your decolonial, feminist epistemological and methodological practice of staying in the communities you're researching and your practice of revising your research after initial interviews. I followed the fortunes of your participants with you in their transitions and through COVID, willing them to achieve their aims, getting to know them along with you in a wonderful humanising narrative arc. Your voice shines through in each chapter too. I could feel you deliberating, questioning and engaging in true Zeynep fashion. The book really is a demonstration of the feminist ethic of care that most of us are struggling to work towards. But here, I think, in this book, you attain. Thank you for this work. So now I'm going to introduce our panelists, and I'll introduce everybody in one go, and then I'll pass to Zeynep for the introduction to your wonderful work. So Dr. Aiko Holvikivi is Assistant Professor of Gender, Peace and Security at the Department of Gender Studies and an Associate Academic at the Centre for Women, Peace and Security. Her research is interested in transnational movements of knowledges and of people and how these are produced by and productive of gendered and racialized insecurity. Her first monograph, also recently out, Fixing Gender, the Paradoxical Politics of Training Peacekeepers, from Oxford University Press, interrogates these themes through an examination of the practice of gender training. This research traces the ways in which training produces knowledge about gender, the processes of circulation, translation, resistance and negotiation that are involved, and the epistemic and political effects of such training. The book draws on field work with military and police peacekeepers in East Africa, the Nordic region, West Africa, and the Western Balkans and Western Europe. Professor, next to her left, Professor Ali Bilgic is Professor of International Relations and Middle East Politics at Loughborough University. He currently serves as the Director of Global Engagement and Research Lead for Challenges to the Public Space and Democracy at the School of Social Sciences and Humanities. And he's also an Associate Editor of International Relations Journal. His research interests encompass Middle East politics and international relations, security studies, post-colonial and feminist international relations, emotions in global politics, and trust building in international relations. He's the author of Rethinking Security in the Age of Migration, 2013, and Turkey, Power and the West, 2016. He's the co-author of the Michigan Guidelines on Refugee Freedom of Movement from 2017, which has been recognized as a reference document in the UNHCR's Ref World. His most recent co-author book, Positive Security, was published in 2022. Dr. Yena Bayramoğlu is a media ethnographer and lecturer in sociology at the University of York. Yena's interdisciplinary work explores the intersection of digital media, migration, queer theory, temporalities, and affect. He has investigated how digital media contribute to the formation of queer diaspora across borders, while also analysing how social media facilitates the spread of racism and disinformation. He's the author of Queer Invisibilities from 2018 and the co-author of Post/Pandemic Life, A Theory of Fragility in 2021, both published in German. He has recently co-edited the special issue Transnational Queer Cultures and Digital Media in 2024 for Communication, Culture and Critique. His multi-sited work has been supported by grants from the Marie Curie Actions, the German Research Foundation and EU Horizon. So, thanks. If we could welcome our panelists and Zeynep first of all, that would be great. You've all written so much and done so much that it's taken a while to introduce you, right? And I'm going to pass, first of all, to Zeynep.
Okay, thank you all so much for coming. It's truly lovely to see you here all to celebrate the launch of my book. I actually have a whole list of people that I want to thank to properly, but I decided to leave that to the end because this week has unfortunately made the book feel even more urgent. So I'm just going to jump right in. On Monday, the UK government released a brutal white paper that intentionally weaponizes the language of immigration control and putting countless lives at risk. It deliberately ignores empirical facts, evades legal and ethical responsibility towards migrants, and purposefully fuels racism and division. This policy change is not about welfare, but it's about punishment, scapegoating, and othering. So I want to situate this book as a part of my refusal to stay silent. It's a rejection of that hostile agenda that the government is trying to impose on actual human beings. And it's a celebration of the presence, rights, and dignity of migrants in this country. So the book, I guess I'd like to start with by sharing how I actually came to this research and the journey that shaped this work. When I was a university student in Ankara, Syrian refugees quickly became central to Turkish politics. The states left them to live in poverty and precarity, while the public grew incredibly hostile. Even when framed through a human rights lens by the civil society networks, the focus remained narrowly on the provision of survival resources, and it was barely on dignity or long-term inclusion. So I think this reflects a specific temporal framework that is rooted in short-term crisis management, rather than imagining futures where refugees and asylum seekers are not just present, but also able to truly belong. So when I first moved to London in 2014, I encountered with the word empowerment for the first time. So this term struck me immediately, right? Because in Turkish, we don't actually have an actual, translation for it, a direct translation for it. So I began to wonder, what does it really mean? First, it shifts the conversation beyond immediate survival and then suggests that refugee assistance could be also about the future. But then the question is, what kind of future does it promise and for whom? If refugee status itself is a result of the nation-state system, how can empowerment be achieved without fundamentally dismantling the very systems that create those marginalization or vulnerabilities in the first place. The ontological premise of empowerment carries an individual focus rather than a structural structural one, and it reveals a colonial logic in how the present is actually constructed. It assumes a position of lack to start with. It assumes turning someone from less into more. It also frames power as something that can be granted from the outside rather than something to be claimed, negotiated, or collectively built. In exploring the term across languages, I found out that many non-Western languages don't actually have a direct equivalent for empowerment. Instead, they specifically use terms that emphasize collective power and mutual support. In contrast, Western languages usually offer a direct translation of empowerment. In the book, I argued that this reflects colonial histories rooted in logics of civilizing and uplifting the colonized. Therefore, the book argues that empowerment may also become a form of governmentality within the asylum sector, a disciplining tool, transforming the non-Western victim into the ideal neoliberal subject. It may become a zero-sum game that reinforces systems of hierarchy and dominance under the guise of benevolent inclusion and integration. This disciplining logic, namely coloniality, is deeply gendered and racialized. The idea of empowering women is framed as saving them from assumed vulnerabilities, which are always located a priori in non-Western societies. This ignores how hostile asylum systems actually play an active role in producing and sustaining those very vulnerabilities in the first place. To receive protection, you need to appear as a defenseless woman in need of compassion. So it's not about rights, but it's instead about requiring compassion from the humanitarians and from the host population. It's not about real life experiences, but it's about legibility. It is depoliticized and stripped of its roots in solidarity and reciprocity found in Black feminist thought. So the question that shaped this book was, what would a feminist intervention look like? Is it possible to approach empowerment differently, reclaiming and reimagining it with emancipation and social justice at its core? That curiosity led me to feminist grassroots organizations and women's communities, which are my gang. I began my research in Birmingham with a self-identified feminist asylum organization that held its weekly sessions in a community church. I showed up, I introduced myself, they were lovely. The group's founder, smiled and, said, "That's great, brilliant piece of work. That sounds like a very important research, but unfortunately, we have more urgent things to do at the moment, so no." So that was my first real encounter as a researcher with a practitioner. Then she added, if you really want to help, you can start in the kitchen. So I did. And then eventually I got promoted to a daycare job and later into an office role where I was able to shadow the solicitors and advocates. That's how I came into this work. From community kitchens to confidential Zoom meetings, from churches to political rallies, and from loud community tea times to silent courtrooms. In those ever-changing spaces and ever-shifting roles, in everyday forms of resistance, the building of solidarities and collective imaginaries, this book was born. I spent a great deal of time with women from different backgrounds and life stories, which has changed me to my core. I witnessed pain and stories filled with loss. It was a very difficult period for me, both as a researcher and a human being. However, the main contribution of this book is not rooted in that hardship. And what has actually changed me wasn't only the suffering. On the contrary, it was the agency, power, resilience, laughter, and friendship that I witness every day in these communities. The women I worked with, despite facing multiple vulnerabilities, were not passive or helpless. Actually, in our conversations, they never described themselves as vulnerable. Instead, they were strategic and clear-eyed. As one woman told me, vulnerability is a performance to access the system. Supporting refugees in the West isn't really about human rights, but it's about what you're expected to be like. Her insight cut through the humanitarian language of rights, exposing its conditionality and coloniality as we cover in our classes. Yet this recognition wasn't about despair, it wasn't about self-pity, it wasn't about defeat, but rather it was about resistance. It was in the radical act of asking, what now and what's next? It meant standing inside hardship and crafting tools, not only to endure, but also to transform. This was not just for themselves, but for many other women in their communities. It speaks to feminist scholarship that shows women not victims of a crisis situation, are not only victims of a crisis situation, instead, crisis situations can actually enhance women's political resilience and engagement. A beginning of a movement, what Sarah Ahmed calls a willful navigation against the grain. Women's communities develop programs that support this kind of resistance, turning lived experience into a community resource, fostering skills exchange. These quote-unquote, right, empowerment practices center on supporting women's individual and collective agency, breaking down dependencies on aid structures. For example, some of the organizations in the UK offer professional advocacy training and public speaking classes to refugee women. One of the participants told me that I don't want any other woman to go through what I have, and this is why I'm here. In France, one organization co-developed a dance workshop with an asylum-seeking woman to help participants to reconnect with their bodies and heal from trauma. These are all acts of agency in action. And in the book, I talk about like women take part in these even before obtaining legal status that unsettles colonial logics that equate political participation with state recognition and it highlights their equal citizenship status as effective contributors to the society. Women's communities can also be highly effective in facilitating access to material resources and social capital for everyday survival, which may later then translate into opportunities that challenge or dismantle dominant gender norms. While hegemonic masculinity can restrict men's ability to adapt, women may be better at navigating change due to their socialized roles of care. women's communities offer each other practical support like paying bills, arranging cheap transformation, finding local markets, which over time can position women as the new leaders within the household. In fact, many women decide to pursue divorce after securing legal recognition. Yet this newly established sense of quote-unquote empowerment can also provoke a dangerous backlash. It may trigger intensified violence from partners seeking to reassert control on women. So this brings us to the central contribution of the book. Empowerment and vulnerability coexist. They are not binaries. Refugee women are not either vulnerable or agentic. They are both at once, just like any of us. Vulnerability does not lie in refugeehood itself, but in the intersection of multiple systems of power, control, and oppression. Seeking asylum itself is an act of agency that one draws on many sources: financial, social, linguistic, emotional, but many people take that for granted. Ignoring this is not just a failure of justice, but it's a missed opportunity for host societies to imagine a future rooted in inclusion, equality, and dignity, a future of transformative change. The global rise of the radical right tells us a different story. It's not a coincidence that this rise is both anti-gender and anti-immigration. History shows us that gender, as an analytical category, has long been instrumentalized to draw and legitimize artificial boundaries between people and societies, boundaries that are fundamental to the making and maintenance of the imperial enterprise, boundaries that are fundamental to fuel moral panics about the UK becoming an island of strangers. As a refusal of this power project, refugee women's empowerment must account for the complex identities, ever-changing needs, and above all, their active strategies of resilience and resistance. It must account for their power. This recognition is essential to dismantling polarization and resisting populism, because migrants and refugees are not going anywhere. They are the future, and the future is feminist and queer. As a next step, I am currently developing a digital platform that aims to bring refugee women, directly connect refugee women with the public to foster skills exchange. The goal is to explore whether new technologies, including AI, can actually reduce institutional dependencies within the asylum sector, and ultimately influence policymaking and integration from a bottom-up manner. This project was recently shortlisted for the LSE Spark Award for Innovation, so we'll see how that goes. I want to end with a conversation that I had with an asylum seeker from Malawi who spent years as an asylum activist in the UK. I once asked her if she felt her activism was visible enough to the public, and she replied, "You know what? I'm so tired of constantly having to prove myself. It's not my job to teach others how to be ethical human beings. That's their responsibility. If they want to understand the systemic injustices that we face every day, we are here." Her words stay with me as a reminder. Being ethical is not an act of charity, it's a duty. It means refusing ignorance and rejecting indifference. It means choosing to pay attention to refugees, to trans people, and to the ongoing genocide in Palestine. Thank you. Yeah, so I would like to thank, a bunch of people. I mean, first and foremost, thanks to LSE Gender, to Sumi, to all my wonderful colleagues, for not only for making this event possible, but for their solidarity. A very special thanks to Nila, yes, for her hard work in organizing everything so smoothly. Thank you, Clare, not for chairing the event today, but also for your unconditional support in everything that I do. It means the world to me. And thank you to all the panelists, to Ali, who planted the seeds of my journey into feminist migration research during my undergrad years, whose early guidance have grown into the work that I'm sharing with you today. To Aiko, who never withholds her generosity from me, and who I feel extremely lucky and privileged to work alongside every day. And to Yener, who always has my back as my co-conspirator in the field. Thank you so much for being here. I'd like to thank my PhD advisor and longtime mentor, Professor Susan Zwingle. I mean, she's not here today, but her solidarity and support are with me in every step that I take. Thank you to all my students who push me to think beyond dominant disciplinary canons with your unfiltered questions and help me to grow every day. To my friends, thank you for all the care and love you have shown me over the years and for making the UK my second home. And last but not least, I'm so happy that my parents are here today. Yes, I would like to thank them for always believing in me and in what I do. So I'll just stop here. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, and thanks for putting your brilliant work in such a kind of contemporary and context of absolute importance as well. I forgot to say, but you will have noticed them, that we're being filmed. So it's not including audio, that's right, isn't it? So it's just images, but if you don't want your image to appear, then just mention it to Nila, who has their hands up. Yes. Afterwards, and then you can be taken out rather than having to announce yourself straight away. So thank you so much for giving us the background and the context. And we're going to move to our panel now. So Zeynep and I decided we'd ask the panelists to say something about how they know Zeynep, pull out some key features of the work and its resonance within the field or in relationship to their own work. And then end with a question for Zeynep. So we'll gather those, the three questions, and then Zeynep will have a chance to respond to those before we open it out to you. And just so you know, panelists, I'll put a little 2-minute warning on my piece of paper, and I'm right in front of you anyway, so you'll see it. So Aiko, can I invite you first?
Hi, everyone. It's nice to see so many familiar faces. I wanted to start by reiterating the congratulations to Zeynep. What a wonderful achievement to have this thought-provoking book with us and published. Congratulations. So I first heard about this research during a job interview for an LSE fellowship, which included a beautiful presentation that had some pictures of your fieldwork that really exuded the kind of warmth and enthusiasm that you bring to your work, and I've been dying to get my hands on it ever since, so I'm really pleased to be holding it now. So, as many of you know, I know Zeynep through our work together at the department as a friend and colleague. We co-teach on the MSc program in Gender, Peace and Security together with Håkon Sandal Wilson. And so, as somebody who knows you a bit now, Zeynep, one of the concepts that I picked up in the book is this term that you use several times of authentic representation. And of course, for you, there's a key concern that refugee women, as we've heard already, be seen as fully agentic actors who are able to speak about and for themselves, and to be depicted as such in scholarship and in advocacy materials. So the argumentation speaks to representation in both senses of the concept as speaking on behalf of one's community, such as an elected representative, as well as being represented in these materials. But part of the reason the term stood out to me is that it felt very meta, because I felt that this book was in many ways an authentic representation of many wonderful qualities that Zeynep has. So first, the book strikes a balance between providing an empathetic, engaged account of refugee women, and particularly the aid workers who work with them, but at the same time, it's committed to critiquing the violence of borders, of asylum regimes, and the role that the aid industry plays in reinforcing notions of European supremacy through a logic of racist and patriarchal protection. And as we've heard, you never shy away from calling those out when you see them. And these were things I recognized from working with Zeynep: a commitment to taking people seriously, and to trying to understand their vantage points and, you know, what they feel and want, and how they go about their business, as well as a striking clarity of ethics, of purpose in the pursuit of justice. And then through it all, there's kind of a sense of optimism and hope that things should and can be better. Yeah. And then second, the manner that the book unfolds has felt very familiar. I've listened to you lecture many times, Zeynep, and I know that many of your students are here and will recognize this as well. And I've always appreciated the knack that you have for telling a story and for engaging your audience. The book proceeds at a really engaging pace. So Zeynep introduces us to a wealth of material that she collected as part of her research. And she allows us to consider the accounts of the people that she's speaking with. So she accompanies her reader throughout the research to her conclusions in a way that kind of allows us to get there with her, as opposed to kind of being told what it is, you know, in a more in that kind of directive sense. So in this way as well, I felt that the book was very authentically Zeynep, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. So thank you for offering it to us and for being such a wonderful friend and colleague. But so turning to the substance of the book, as requested, I wanted to comment on a couple of things that struck me as particularly pertinent reading it in this location and time, and you've already introduced some of those things. But first, I wanted to note that it was very interesting for me to read this personally, because I don't know if you know this, but I've lived in the UK for 14 years, and in between that I lived in France for 7 years. Both of these times with a privileged migratory status. So I'm not saying this to claim that I, you know, share a similar location to refugee women in these concepts, but nonetheless, I recognized on a very kind of personal level certain elements about political culture and the workings of the bureaucracy that related to experiences I have had. So you're theorizing of the impact of British multiculturalism, but also neoliberalism, as well as French traditions of republicanism with its universalist claims, really helped me make sense of some of the experiences I had had, and it was very interesting to read that. And then your analysis of the two different contexts, they challenged my thinking in very productive ways, I think, because first, coming to this question of the role of the state in the provision of refugee aid, before reading this book, I would have been inclined to assume that the retreat of the state in neoliberal Britain would have been a more straightforwardly more problematic scenario. But your analysis demonstrates how the strong presence of the French state shapes the work of aid organizations, basically turning them into implementing agencies of the state, and for them to describe their work as apolitical, which I found a quite striking claim. So grappling with this argument forced me also to reckon with how my own positionality, having grown up in a Nordic country, informed the assumptions that I made about the role of the state and the desirability of demanding state provision and state protection. And it prompted me to think about this question in more complex ways. So that was something about coming from looking at these two different contexts. And the second thing that I wanted to discuss as a key feature of the work is, and this is, I think, the most important one for me, is what the book gives us in how it challenges the reader to think about conceptualizations that are held about refugee women. So as you've so powerfully introduced in your introduction, Zeynep, I think our present context in this location demonstrates just how crucial doing this kind of work is. Many of us in the UK, especially over recent years, were appalled by the Conservative government's plan, if you remember, to send asylum seekers to Rwanda to await the processing of their claims. And those plans were put on hold, but in case we needed a reminder, which we didn't, of how the widespread malaise of kind of racist and xenophobic discourses is, as you said, on Monday, the Prime Minister announced a new policy which was actually targeting legal routes to migration. But the sentiment that underlies it, the Prime Minister claimed, and I quote, "This strategy will finally take back control of our borders and close the book on a squalid chapter for our politics, our economy, and our country." And this is a Labour government. So this is kind of the context in which you're intervening. And in this kind of toxic debate, we're often asked to choose between binary positions of being either for refugees or not, or for migration or not, and also to portray refugees in these kind of reductive binary terms as either threats to the nation and its citizens, or as kind of, you know, deserving victims or hardworking contributors to the national economy, or these kinds of flattening out of subject positions. And so what I think is remarkable in this book is that it stages an intervention into these kinds of terms of understanding. So Zeynep is steadfast in her insistence that we see refugee women as a heterogeneous group, as complex and contradictory subjects, as we all are. And this becomes apparent early on in the book, where she talks about, of all things, of one of these aid spaces, and about the attention that's drawn to the design and the furnishings of the space, and about the decisions that were made to try and make the space not feel like a clinic or a courtroom, but to feel like home and feel inviting. And I was really struck by this, because attending to this kind of detail invites us to consider that being a refugee is not an ontological designation. It's not an identity category that can be reduced. It goes against the idea that a person can be reduced to a particular traumatic event or situation or need or, economic contribution. But it provides, it's just the first of many that provide a starting point for understanding people who are seeking asylum as people who have feelings, wishes, and experiences. And importantly, Zeynep underscores throughout that refugee women must be viewed as agentic actors. And in taking this claim, the book, of course, takes a nuanced understanding of agency as the ability to make decisions under potentially oppressive conditions. So one of the things that the book does is talks us through the particular reasonings of individual refugee women who choose not to disclose situations of domestic violence or to leave those relationships, and demonstrates the rationality behind those decisions of people, making very informed calculations about their own safety and their, likelihood of acquiring legal status. And she also draws attention to the forms of political action and advocacy that refugee women take. And these range from kind of the overtly political, or less overtly political, because, you know, the act of fleeing or migrating is itself arguably an agentic action. Scholars like Nadine El-Anani have called this a politics of anti-colonial refusal, the politics of migration. And then they range to the, you know, overt political advocacy. So I'm going to finish on this point, don't worry, Claire. So importantly, the book highlights that refugee women should be viewed as agentic actors, regardless of whether or not they engage in political advocacy. In this way, her conceptualization of agency echoes feminist scholars like Saba Mahmood, who argue that feminists should be attentive to and recognize women's agency, even when it doesn't forward particular Western feminist ideas of what should happen. And so in all of these ways, Zeynep's book, even while it focuses, her question focuses on aid workers, it nonetheless invites us to see refugee women as a heterogeneous group, and that's far beyond this kind of blanket statement of, you know, different in terms of race, age, class, migratory status, to paint a very deeply human picture of the subjects that she's dealing with and to challenge these kind of debates. So I'm going to wrap up my brief appreciation of the book there. And I have a closing question for Zeynep. So you gave us a really fascinating account of how you came across the concept of empowerment and what it does in different languages, and you know, suggesting that it's in itself can be a colonial concept. And I wanted to know a little bit more about how you locate that in relation to the kind of material factors that are being privileged in some of the aid work, you know, in your discussions with aid workers, where they say that, no, what's most important is legal status or acquiring physical needs. And this isn't to suggest that that the two are in opposition or separable from each other, but I guess I was interested to hear more about how you landed on this as your key concept and your site of inquiry. But again, beautiful book, and thank you for providing it and for inviting me to read it.
Well, I think everyone now know how I know Zeynep. It is not easy to be joyful nowadays if you're an academic, and I don't need to explain to this room why. But there are some moments like this. A student that you met when you were a new lecturer, I don't know which year, was it 2013 even, something like that, when you still had hair. Became a published scholar, and she remembered you and then invited you to celebrate this achievement. Congratulations on your book, on this fantastic book. I'm sure it will be the first of many that you will be writing in the next decades of your career. When I was reading Zeynep's book, I remembered a conversation I had with a friend years ago. She was telling me about her recent trip to Iran in 2014. They went to, with her friend, they were going to another city, and they were going to take the train. Segregation, they were going to women-only carriage. So they entered it, and the train started moving, and in that moment, some women removed their headscarves, some of them kept it, food is out. They started talking to each other, they started discussing politics, they started cutting business deals, they were sometimes talking about their neighbors, etc. But they were also talking about the negotiations going on before the first nuclear deal. And then many things happened in that moment, in that everyday politics moment. And then the train arrived, people left, the women went on their own way. When I was reading Zeynep's book about these everyday spaces, I had the same feelings. I had the same understanding as to how important to focus on what is always being silenced, what is always being marginalized, what's always being considered apolitical. Victimhood of Iranian women, for example, how does it look, how different it looks if we actually focus on the everyday of life in Iran. In the West, we generally remember that Iranian women were not victims when they went out of protest. It's because we don't really focus on what is going on in the everyday politics in Iran. It is not victimhood. There's so much agency going on. There's so much power is circulating in these everyday spaces of politics. Of course, everyday politics is messy, but it is also innovative. People carve spaces for their own agency, to practice their own agency in this everyday, mundane, banal space of life. They realize objectives and they become anew with strangers. Many conversations Zeynep very nicely put in the book and analyzed. Again, this kind of connections were created, new forms of power are being circulated in this everyday spaces. Everyday itself is a great opportunity for all of us, and feminists know that very well, to unpack how power pervasively circulates, as well as being accepted, appropriated, and challenged. In IR, my discipline, international relations, we don't like the everyday very much because it's messy, it's complicated. It doesn't really fit into our neat, nice, analytical categories. State works very well. If you focus on the elite, fantastic. You can write, because you have to consider new publications, you have to consider your grant applications. And seriously, how can you actually write the impact case study if you focus on the everyday in this way? It is so complex. It is so messy. And most importantly, it doesn't fit our understanding of time. Because we love the wars, we love the big events, we love the revolutions. Who cares about these ephemeral moments in time? But if we don't focus on this ephemerality, this impermanence of politics, then how can we really understand how really power works? So, Zeynep's book is such a good work in everyday politics. And it is doing such an important work for all of us. And directing us, urging us to challenge what we are being told to study by the disciplines. Because if we do not study it every day, we are part of the epistemological disciplining of bodies and subjects. We are part of it. We are part of the silencing. We are part of the marginalizing. As I often say to my own PhD students now, it is very important to know what you are not studying, what you choose not to study, as well as what you are studying, what you choose to study. So the choice that Zeynep made here is an important political choice, as well as an analytical choice. So what strikes me most in the book is that Zeynep has taken two powerful victimhood narratives, refugeehood and womanhood, and turned both of them upside down and inside out. It is messy, but it is beautiful. Because it is messy. Because it shows something to us that we can't really see in these neat analytical works that we are asked to produce every day in our academic lives. This everyday politics is the moments where the refugee women, and Zeynep shows that very well, connect to each other, exercise power, practice their agency, but also learn from each other and move forward. A new transition, a new moment for them. There are alternative standpoints for us to find out, to learn about politics. One question that I have for Zeynep going forward, so I very much like Zeynep to continue with every day, but my question is a bit also different. One of the things I realized in the book is that this everyday encounters between refugee women in this everyday banal spaces, they actually create some effective solidarity between each other. So emotions are doing quite an important work in these kitchens, in this artwork, in these workshops. Emotions are doing some political work here. I'd like you to a bit reflect on that and share your views on what the emotions are doing here. As the last word, and I of course look forward to hear what Yana has to say. Yes, this is an island of strangers. That's fine. This is a room full of strangers. Yeah. This is a world of strangers. Being a stranger is a beautiful thing. Remember Strange Encounters of Sarah Ahmed. It is an opportunity to reflect. It's an opportunity to open up. It's an opportunity to become anew. Let's own it. Let's being strangers and learn from each other, as Zeynep has shown us very well in her book. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's such a big pleasure and joy to be here to celebrate the publication of this brilliant book. Thank you, Zeynep, for the invitation. Thank you for thinking of me. Congratulations. And I will also begin my remarks with the story of how we met. I don't know if you remember. If you're a migrant scholar, sooner or later your path will cross with others who, like you, carry the weight of multiple worlds. Those who speak the same language, those who search for home in syllables that rarely echo in the diaspora. That's how I met Zeynep. We were introduced by our mutual academic friends in a queer bar in Soho. I was at the time going through a heartbreak. Naturally, we began with what we call in Turkish, dertleşmek. So it's a sorrowful conversation, and it's never only about conversation. By opening up emotionally, you get also closer. Whether it's over tea, rakı, wine, or whatever is within reach, it's a ritual, a communion of wounds and words. So I poured out my story, and in the act of telling, something else happened. We drew closer. That emotional conversation opened the door to our intellectual ones. Our shared feelings soon gave way to shared frustrations with theory, with frameworks, with the limits of existing literature. We realized we spoke the same language, not only the mother tongue of our childhood homes, but the rarer dialect of academic kinship. I'm a media scholar drawn toward questions of migration, borders, and diaspora. And what I've often found in the literature are archives of ache, detailed accounts of how anti-immigration systems carve harm into migrant lives. Important, yes, necessary, undoubtedly. But I've always been more curious about the possibilities of care, agency, and politics, about what emerges when migrants meet each other in the margins, not just as subjects of damage, but as agents of connection and political resistance. This is what Zeynep's work so brilliantly captures. At its heart, Zeynep's work challenges the familiar preoccupations within migration and diaspora studies. Too often, these fields are preoccupied with narratives of vulnerability, especially when it comes to refugees. And when the focus turns to women in flight, a deeper truth is too easily overlooked. For what is to cross a border without the necessary papers, without the state's permission, if not a radical act of agency? To choose the path across deserts, over mountains, through dangerous waters, is to declare one's will against the machinery of exclusion. It is an act not of submission, but of resistance, of courage, of power. Zeynep's work invites us to see this journey not simply as survival, but as transformation, an act of empowerment, a deliberate, forceful intervention against the violent logics of global apartheid and its border regimes. Rather than centering merely on refugee women, Zeynep's ethnographic lens widens to observe the very institutions that claim to support them, the charities in the UK and France. In her analysis in the UK, for instance, we witness moments of solidarity. Here, charities and advocacy groups do more than assist. They collaborate. Refugee women are not merely recipients of aid. They become professionals, activists, leaders. They enter the struggle for justice not just as outsiders, but as co-authors of social transformation. This is made possible through creative participatory methods that foster trust, that build spaces of safety. In these spaces, women find not only refuge, but room to speak, to create, to thrive. But across the channel, a different story unfolds. In France, where many charities operate under state funding, the approach shifts. Women refugees are cast narrowly, as vulnerable, as lacking, as problems to be managed. The focus is on instruction, on integration, on molding individuals to fit a pre-existing national frame. Here, migration is not seen as a generative force for a society, nor refugees as agents of change. Instead, the emphasis lies on adaptation, on learning the rules and values of a society that offers no place for transformation. When I was reading Zeynep's book, I realized that this resonates deeply with the German context, where I worked for 13 years, where the state-funded charities too often concern themselves with disciplining the so-called unruly migrant body, shaping it to fit within narrow frames of acceptability. What I found especially moving in Zeynep's book is her attention to what might seem at first glance insignificant. The quiet, everyday details of life, as Aiko also and Ali also mentioned, the everyday, this emphasis on everyday was very touching. These are not grand gestures, but small objects that quietly shape migrants' experience. For instance, a rug, a poster, a vase of fresh flowers, carefully placed in a community room in Birmingham where migrant women gather. Such details might appear trivial, especially when we are accustomed to speaking of refugees through the weighty language of policy and asylum procedures. But Zeynep shows us that it is precisely these everyday elements that craft a sense of belonging or its absence. The arrangement of space, the assemblage of objects, architecture, and bodies, these create atmospheres. They shape how one feels, how one comes to inhabit a place or feel exiled within it. I remember here of Arta Bra's beautiful formulation of home. Home, she tells us, is not just bricks and mortar. It is the familiar rhythms of everyday life, the scent of a particular spice, the way light falls on a wall, or the warmth of a shared routine. In these everyday fragments that can make one feel rooted or entirely out of place. Zeynep draws a poignant contrast with the spaces in France. These, there, she notes, the rooms offered to refugee women are sparse, bare, institutional, echoing the cold functionality of state offices. Even the websites of the charities mirror this coldlessness, faceless, lifeless, void of any trace of women they claim to support. It is in this contrast that Zeynep's insight shines, revealing that even the most mundane details carries the power to include or exclude, to comfort or alienate. And in doing so, she reminds us that politics is not only in law and policy, but in the texture of everyday life. This is also where my own research on queer migration finds its location. I'm particularly drawn to the role of digital technologies, those small everyday objects we carry in our pockets, scroll through it in transit, fall asleep beside. And my question to Zeynep arises in part from the resonance with my own research. One of the core provocations in Zeynep's work is the idea that becoming a refugee can be an empowering experience. That act of distancing oneself from the geographies left behind and from familial contexts where women are often confined, roles of caregiving, of silence, of subordination, can open up new paths of self-realization. Migration in this sense becomes not merely a rupture, but a reconstitution, a process through which women assert agency, rebuild identity, and craft new forms of life. It's a powerful and vital argument, I love it. And yet, I find myself thinking about a similar, though deeply problematic, strand in queer migration literature, where migration is often framed as a teleological and one-way journey from repression to liberation. In these narratives, queer and trans migrants are imagined as escaping homophobic or transphobic elsewheres to arrive in the West, portrayed often uncritically as a sanctuary, a queer haven. These stories, while affirming, risk reproducing homonationalist and femonationalist logics. They construct a world where certain places, often in the global south, are cast as inherently dangerous, regressive, or even unlivable, while Europe is positioned as the moral and political apex in matters of gender and sexuality. And so, I would like to invite Zeynep to reflect with us. How might we speak of refugee women's empowerment through migration without reinscribing these problematic binaries? How can we affirm the agency, the strength, the transformation inherent in these journeys without falling into the trap of imagining Europe as the only side of freedom and elsewhere as perpetual side of danger? Thank you, Zeynep, for this brilliant work.
Yes, I can just reply here. Yes, can people hear me? Okay, cool. Wow, thank you so much for all your kind words. I think now that I'm just like so happy that I just, in order to hear more compliments, I'm just gonna start writing another book like tomorrow or something. Right, okay, so can I start with Yenar's question? Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Of course, there is like this risk of like turning the narrative around empowerment into a strategy of pinkwashing, right? You know, oh, because we're like so civilized, we're like, you know, prone to like support human rights more, and you know, in our societies. You know, we welcome queer refugees, you know, we are more like LGBTQ friendly and stuff. But then I guess my intervention, or like what I tried to say in the book, is that this type of empowerment, like I just want to ask whether it's possible to approach empowerment as not something to be granted from a host population, but instead it's about how, being a migrant, you know, being in a difficult situation, you develop your own survival strategy. So this is the type of empowerment that I guess wanted to focus on. So refugeehood itself is not inherently empowering, and especially in this like political climate, like for queer, like, you know, asylum seekers, you know, Western countries are not like safe havens, right? But rather, yeah, I think the empowerment that I try to highlight, or like to try to construct, is that, you know, it's about how people actually navigate these systems or survive these systems that are inherently racist and heteropatriarchal, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yes, great. I feel like this is all okay. Okay, cool. And Eileen's question on emotions. Yeah, so like I found like the emotion, like the use of emotions in these communities, like very, very powerful, because, you know, Western political philosophy or scientific philosophy tells us that, you know, emotions do not matter. And actually going back to like, you know, that like politics can't be about emotions, but it's about rationality, right? Which is a lie. It's 100% about emotions. And then obviously there is like a public-private division. You know, the public-private division actually speaks to that, you know, how like Machiavelli in Prince, he talks about actually women are emotional because they're mothers, and that's why they should never ever, you know, do politics, because that might be very dangerous, you know. So what I found very powerful about the use of emotions in this community is that they just like embrace it, right? So these communities, right, once they have, like, let's say, the first thing that they do when they like create a community is that they came up with their own song, right? And this is just like a great opportunity for everybody to just like participate. You know, it enhances like belongingness, and it just like go against the mainstream patriarchal logics that forms like everyday spaces or like power relations that shapes the conduct of mainstream politics, basically. So I found that very powerful, not only emotions, but also like the way how they approach to like women's bodies in a different way. They urge them to take part in performances as part of like, you know, their community activities or like political allies. So this was right before COVID, that this organization that I worked with in, like, they're based in London, and then they, it's part of this like national coalition of like women asylum organizations in the UK, and they actually came up with this idea of circles of sisterhood. So they sent the dance moves and the actual song to their partners, and then they did the performance during the International Women's Day like rally in London, but they also had like different screens. So each organization with its members, they did the exact same like dance performance in different cities and sang the same song. So it was like very powerful. Yeah, I mean, Yener mentioned that, you know, because of the way we approach to politics, it, as you also mentioned in your speech, like it needs to be rational, right? It needs to be, you know, never like, it can't be about emotions and stuff. Like the rhetoric or like the space that asylum sector usually offers is just these clinic-like, you know, environments that, I mean, I even felt like nervous, you know, and I wasn't an asylum seeker. So I just like quite like that, like the transformative power of like, you know, building a space, using emotions, approach, like urging women to actually like use their bodies in their activism. I found this very, very powerful. And yes, for Aiko's question, yeah, definitely like material privileges, of course. If you just like don't have a shelter to sleep tonight, of course you just can't be, you know, it can't be about, oh, like asylum system, I'm going to like practice politics, or I'm just going to like enroll into this like public speaking class. Of course, you know, you just need like a material, like, you know, material, like the material resources to engage in politics in that sense. But I think what I was in awe with all these organizations and their strategies is that they don't actually, you know, oh, let's secure a legal, you know, status first, and then we can take the rest, you know, later, take care of the rest later. It doesn't really work, because it takes like around 8 to 10 years for an asylum seeker to get like a decision on their like cases in the UK. So once you are, and this is alongside, you know, you're in the system that you constantly need to represent yourself vulnerable, right? So women that I work with in these communities, they said that, yes, this is a performance, but actually when you say it to yourself 50 times in a day, after 5 years, it becomes your reality, right? So, yes, material factors are important, but also, you know, these communities actually offer very, very valuable opportunities for women to, yes, like secure their access to material resources, but also at the same time, you know, promoting belongingness and, you know, fostering inclusion and integration at the same time, if that exactly. Yes, thank you.
Let's just give a quick round of applause for everybody. And thank you so much for all of your amazing interventions. We've got 10 minutes, and I would like to propose to start with one round of questions and comments from the floor. Can I ask that if you have a question, it's a brief one and only one? And if you could say who you are when you ask it, and bear in mind that 10 minutes means a 30-second comment or question. And then we'll let Zeynep take a minute and a half to reply, and then we'll see if we can have another round of questions. So can I get a sense of who would like to ask something or make a comment or any kind of intervention that would be something from the floor? Oh, perfect. So Sadie over there, and then over here, and yes, okay, Sadie. Oh, I think you have you can turn your mic on. You have to hold it, I think. That's
On?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll hold it. This always happens in this room. Thank you very much, everybody, for your discussion. Really quickly, I'm really struck by the everyday and the quotidian in the work. I haven't read it, so I'm basing this on what I've heard this evening. But I wondered about how that fits with your title here, which emphasizes structure. So how do you manage that in the book? That relationship is a big question, but it's fine.
Oh, you have to turn your mic on, and someone has to hold the. There you go.
Head. Okay. Thank you so much. It was so interesting. I was just wondering, because sometimes I think with the question of refugees, it's very hard to kind of like advocate for any type of intervention, because it always feels like it's the kind of this politic that can always has to like grant something, as you said. So in the process of researching this agency and this strategic thinking that you were talking about, was something raised in terms of like how can we intervene in recognition of it without kind of like suffocating its kind of natural being within refugee communities?
Can you say who you are?
Eleonora, I'm a master's student.
Perfect. And who are you?
Sadie, gender department.
Great. Did you want to?
Sure, yeah. I'm Lisa. I'm also a master's student. You know me. I was just wondering how you thought this was going to impact your future teaching and research.
Great. Okay, that's a good 3 to kick us off. Just brief responses, Zeynep.
Yes. Teaching. I think I would love to like teach more on like, you know, co-creation, like interventions in terms of like co-creation of like knowledge with academic community, with non-academic communities, or like, yeah, I think I'm like more interested in like epistemology and like different methodologies at the moment. I want to use like my experience in these communities to like carry out like some work on, you know, method like feminist queer like methodologies and like epistemologies. So I think that's what I want to do with my teaching. well, ideally. But also, my next research project is it's about how these actors that I talk about in the book already, but also like new partners in the field, actually like what has happened after, you know, Brexit, or like, you know, what are like how do they navigate you know, the current political climate. So I want to like extend my contributions in the book with like focusing on more actors. I'm actually like applying to so many different grant opportunities, but I'm just gonna cut it short here. Yes, and then Sadie's question was on how is that like work on everyday spaces is relevant to aid structures, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so like I have like participants from diverse backgrounds, and then they all have like different roles in these communities, right? Some of them are volunteers, some of them are like actually professional advocates, some of them are just, you know, members of these communities. And then of course like there is this always this asymmetry between, you know, objectives, but also like different in one section of the book I also talk about, you know, these feminist interventions can also be problematic in the sense that how do we define feminist, like a feminist intervention in the first place, you know, because not everybody in these communities actually agree on the same principles, right? But I guess what I found very powerful was the fact that they were still like this emphasis on like having the sisterhood as an alternative support system that replaces the neglect of like the state or like political authorities. And so they actually focused on that, but like it never like going back to what Bell Hooks or like Patricia Hill Collins says, right? It's never about symmetry. It's not about, you know, having this like homogenized symmetrical community, but it's rather about, as Ali said, right, like being strangers, but like create, like, you know, talking to each other, listening to each other, so that they, you know, they can come together to change something that affects them all. Yeah. So, and then Eleonora's question, it was about how like these the interventions of these communities are not about the suffering, but rather like how do they address like foreign policy decisions or like big political. Did I get it right?
How can they be addressed in the context where they are refugees? How can, like, is it about states and host community backing off and like letting be with material support, or are like was there kind of like a positive imagination of like what it would look like to not suffocate these kind of manifestations of agency while still kind of not being apart from each other? I don't know if it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yes, so there are like all these, you know, creative strategies and programs that these communities offer. I mean, one of them, as I mentioned, it was like professional, you know, advocacy training. So when I was doing my field work, right, COVID happened out of the blue, so, which was quite interesting, you know, like it actually an interesting period to see how actually like women were able to use that training, right, to actually say something about the current situation that affects them. So even though that like the in-person like community meetings were like, you know, they stopped happening, but women actually they came together online to put in use of the skills that they learned in their like from their training programs, so that they can like write like short statements, but also create some artworks to share with the rest of the public and the politicians actually, to see, you know, how COVID shapes them, but also not, you know, as an asylum seeker, but also as a woman asylum seeker, let's say like a single mom, for example. So it is these creative like strategies. I mean, it can be about, for example, like the artistic programs that the organizations offer. If women, let's say, if they want to like address their lack of access to material resources, or if they want to emphasize on their suffering, they can do that. But they can actually, most of the time, they actually use those spaces or like opportunities to say something about the future, right? Or like offering a different political future, basically. So, yes.
That's perfect. We need to end there. We don't have time for another round. But I was very struck, Jenna, by the phrase that you used, rare dialect of academic kinship, because I was thinking that that was something that's emerged in the course of this celebration of Zeynep's work. It's the perfect characterization of the conversation that has happened in the room. And I would like to invite everybody not only to thank all of our speakers, but to come up to the 11th floor to the department to continue that academic kinship and perhaps even build on it and make it anew. And so thank you to everybody for your participation, and thank you particularly to Zeynep for her